Unfortunately, there were technical difficulties at the Cambridge Union, and my portion of the debate, "This House prefers the screen to the page," was canceled. The debate went on without me, but as I had done a lot of prep and research, I thought at least a few people might want to watch my final rehearsal, which I happened to record to prepare for the event. I've not watched what actually ended up taking place, but here is my argument about the joy of the screen. Thank you for inviting me. This is my first debate ever. I'm sort of more of a behind-the-scenes type. So to take on Sir Peter Bazalgette, a former head of the Cambridge Union, is, I'd say, daunting, let alone the esteemed students who won the honor to be here, and I'm thankful to have the venerable Professor Andrew Clevens on my side. Before I start, I want to take a moment to honor my mother, who graduated from Cambridge Girton College with a PhD in 1953. Finally, I might get some approval from her. So I'm here to argue that the screen is preferable to the page, and being meta, I'm here on screen to argue that my existence on screen is more compelling than my existence on the page. But we'll get to that. First, I'll admit that I'm an avid reader, and I believe that the imagination is beautifully sparked by the written word, but the written word is incomplete. And that incompleteness cannot compete with the fullness and the emotional connection of the screen experience. When I started preparing this, I thought, if I were asked to speak on this topic as a lecture, as opposed to the debate, I would immediately try to engage the audience by peppering the speech with visuals, images, and clips. So here's a real-world example where I already feel the screen is more engaging to the audience than the page. I want to provide something more to look at, to engage with, and those visuals would help solidify my points and make them more memorable to the audience. So let's break this down with a little historical perspective. The film semiotics theorist Christian Metz wrote about the limitations of written language based on its basic components. He said that written language is limited in its codes, meaning the letters of the alphabet or maybe the dictionary, whereas the screen or camera has infinite possibilities. There's no dictative code that straitjackets the imagination. So the word is fixed and the screen is fluid. On a slightly broader view of that, Stephen Kern, in his book, The Cultural History of Time and Space, and we will come back to time and space, argues that in the period 1880 to 1918, so many revolutions took place in psychology and science and travel and time zones and mobile technology and, of course, film, that ever since then, the written word has been on the defensive. It just can't keep up with the comfort and proliferation and fullness of the experience of the screen. But that's all kind of theoretical, and this compellingness of the screen is more visceral. It's more present and direct as a provocation. Are you more scared of the word blood or of seeing someone bleed? Of the word scream or of seeing and hearing an actual person screaming? The screen uses more of our senses. As a director of screen media, I think a lot about how to make the audience's experience the fullest, to make the audience react and feel. I use the visuals to take the text to the next level, to make it mean even more than the words on the page. In order to illustrate this, I wondered if I could come up with a pure example of page versus screen. Being a math nerd or ex-math major, I decided to try and break it down into its most component parts and came up with two examples where only a single word was employed to tell a story. For the page version, I chose William Kotzwinkle's cult novel, The Fan Man, where there's an entire chapter made up of the word dorky. The chapter is bookended by explanations that I paraphrase. Tomorrow is my dorky day. Then the chapter, dorky, 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 dorky. And the following chapter, I always feel better after my dorky day. I contrast that with the infamous screen scene from David Simon's TV series The Wire. In this scene, the two actors repeatedly speak only one word, an expletive that's probably not appropriate to speak in this esteemed venue. But you will know the common parlance, the F-bomb. The actors are exploring a crime scene and they emote their reactions to their discoveries simply by the way they say the word in each different circumstance. So here there's two advantages of the screen. One is the visuals that are evocative and provocative. It is a gruesome crime scene. Visual content is already expressing more than reading about it. But for argument's sake, let's say that the literary description happens to be as effective as those visuals. Then we have the second screen advantage to fall back on, the actors. Reading that word on the page does not have the nuances, the variation, and thus the impact that we experience by seeing and hearing the subtleties that the actors bring to the word and thus the scene. And it is remarkable how many variations they can bring out of those 4 letters. Expanding beyond the single word example, I expect the opposition to argue that screen adaptations of books are often considered inferior to the written source, and I don't doubt this. I can think of numerous examples where I prefer the book to the movie. But this is not exclusive. In fact, there are even specific times where authors have acknowledged that the screen interpretation is superior to their own works. Chuck Palahniuk, for instance, talking about Fight Club, said he was actually embarrassed that the book is inferior to the movie and that the movie focuses the themes much better than his book. A second example is Who Framed Roger Rabbit, where the author so completely preferred the movie to his original work that he rewrote the book to the movie story. Of course, there are many examples of the opposite, a poor interpretation. But I would ask you to consider whether it has to do with which you experienced first. Often it is one's first experience, whether book or movie, where the imagination imprints on the brain. And whichever happens first is what may well influence what you react to the most. Is the virgin experience of a story more important than the medium itself? One of the most basic advantages of the screen is that it uses more of our senses. The page does not have the ability to spark the eyes and ears. Proust may be our landmark here, since he so famously writes exactly about how senses influence our emotional responses. The infamous experience of smelling the Madeleine cake that sparks his most famous work. And yes, that smell, and other than the rarity of odorama smell-o-vision, the screen is not set up for smell, but it is ideal for oral components. So let's talk about sound and music, particularly music. There's little parallel between listening to a song or a score in a movie and having it mentioned on the page. Music has a very specific imprint on our memory. Why can you remember so many song lyrics and so little poetry? It's not simply because you don't hear the poetry repeatedly like the music. It's more to do with how strongly our brains respond to music. Music sparks much deeper responses, and we have a vocabulary of sounds that create fear and joy and simple memories. We remember where we were and what we were doing when we first heard a melody or lyric. So the screen gives us these extra visceral elements, the sound and the music, and this hearing music is stronger for sure than reading a song title. To conclude, I will be so egotistical as to use an example of my own work. And I'm going to use the longest-running science fiction TV show, Doctor Who, hence the reference to all of time and space. Doctor Who did not start as a book. It started as a script. Yes, words on a page, but its success was based on the visual content. Further, its success has spawned numerous books and inspired kids to read, once they had the visuals and the voices of the characters already in their heads. The screen led to the page. I'm going to talk about the unusual episode entitled Heaven Sent. It's a conceptual episode in that it is basically one actor through the entire 55 minutes. The theme is a meditation on grief. So the question is, which medium, the script or the TV episode, provides the most enjoyment and/or the most emotional impact? When the showrunner-writer Stephen Moffat handed the script to me, he said, "It is possible that this is not makeable," by which he meant that he wasn't sure that the complex emotion and content of the script would be translatable to the screen. Could an episode that spans 4.5 billion years, taking place in a clockwork castle, be represented on screen and still bring out the emotional core of loneliness, of being trapped, of grief? Reading it, it was beautiful and complicated and smart, but not really emotional. Above all, it was complex. But did it evoke loneliness and grief? Well, actually, most people who read it just had trouble visualizing it, and I spent a great deal of time drawing them diagrams to help them. But my job was really to translate Stephen's beautiful words into his emotional intent and see if I could provide visuals that would strengthen the script and its impact. At the end of the day, we had made a piece of work that is considered by many one of the most effective episodes in terms of emotional responses. And it's the combination of all the elements that make it work. It's the screen, the visuals, and the oral that make it so, not simply the words. It's the tremendous performance by Peter Capaldi in spite of the dialogue being so sparse, the stunning images from the cinematographer, and the musical opus from the composer that are additive. They are greater than the words. So I'll finish with a meta-thought experiment. If I were debating by handing you my speech, would that be more effective than my presenting it on the screen, no matter how nervous I am? And further to that, would this be even more effective if I were allowed to use clips to show you what I'm talking about? The screen is, I argue, more powerful than the word. Just offer a kid a book or a screen and see which the majority of them will choose. I hope you'll vote in favor of the fuller experience of the screen. Thank you.